Let me start with something that might sting a little. That burst of motivation you felt last Monday morning, the one where you woke up early, made your coffee, told yourself, this is the week everything changes. Where did it go by Wednesday afternoon? It evaporated, not because you're weak, not because you lack willpower. It evaporated because motivation is, by its very nature, a consumable resource. You used it up. And then you sat there wondering what's wrong with you, why you can't sustain the energy, why other people seem to just keep going while you stall out every few days. Here's what nobody told you, those people who keep going. Most of them don't feel motivated either. They just built something that doesn't require motivation to function. The common understanding of motivation goes something like this. You need to find your why. You need to feel inspired. You need to connect with some deep emotional driver, and once you have that, the energy will come. Entire industries are built on selling you that feeling, motivational seminars, inspirational quote accounts, vision board workshops. And look, I'm not saying those things are entirely useless. What I'm saying is they solve the wrong problem. The real problem isn't that you lack a reason to act. You have plenty of reasons. You know you should be prospecting. You know you should be following up with that client. You know you should be building your portfolio, writing that proposal, making that call. The reasons are clear. What's missing isn't the why. What's missing is the architecture that makes action happen even when the feeling isn't there. Think about it this way. If you had to rely on feeling thirsty every time you needed to drink water, you'd be chronically dehydrated. You don't wait for thirst. You keep a water bottle on your desk. You build the environment. The environment triggers the behavior. The behavior sustains the result. Motivation in this analogy is thirst. It shows up sometimes, but you cannot build a life on sometimes. The mistake most people make is treating motivation as the cause of action. It's actually the other way around. Action, more often than not, is the cause of motivation. You don't feel like writing until you sit down and start writing. You don't feel like calling prospects until you pick up the phone and hear a human voice on the other end. The feeling follows the motion, not the other way around. And this isn't just a nice reframe. This is how your brain actually works. Here's the core idea, and I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need motivation. You need a system. A system is what operates when you don't feel like operating. Motivation is weather. A system is climate infrastructure. You don't cancel your life because it's raining. You build a roof. Let me explain what's happening inside your skull when you chase motivation, because once you see the mechanism, you'll understand why it's such an unreliable fuel source. Your brain has a structure called the reticular activating system, the RAS. Think of it as a filter. At any given moment, your brain is bombarded with millions of bits of sensory information, and the RAS decides what gets through to your conscious awareness. When you set an intention, I'm going to crush it this week, your RAS temporarily tunes into opportunities, ideas, and cues related to that intention. That's why after a motivational speech, the world briefly seems full of possibility. Your filter shifted, but here's the catch. The RAS responds to consistency, not intensity. One explosive burst of intention doesn't rewire it. Repeated, boring, daily exposure to the same task does. That's why systems work and motivation spikes don't. A system gives your RAS the same signal day after day after day until it locks in and starts filtering the world in your favor automatically. Now let's talk about dopamine, because this is where most people get completely wrecked without knowing it. Dopamine is not, as popular culture suggests, the pleasure chemical. Dopamine is a prediction and anticipation molecule. Your brain releases dopamine not when you get the reward, but when you expect the reward. This is critical. When you set a big, exciting, emotionally charged goal, I'm going to build a 6-figure business this year, your brain floods you with dopamine. Feels amazing, feels like progress, but you haven't done anything yet. you've just anticipated. And the problem with that dopamine hit is that your brain now feels like something has already been accomplished. The neurochemical reward came before the work. So when it's time to actually sit down and do the tedious, unglamorous work, the spreadsheets, the follow-up emails, the awkward cold calls, your brain says, "Wait, I already got my reward. Why would I do this uncomfortable thing?" This is why people who spend a lot of time visualizing success without coupling it to immediate action often end up less productive, not more. The brain confuses the simulation for the execution. Researchers like Gabriel Oettingen at NYU have documented this extensively. Positive fantasies about the future, when not paired with concrete obstacle planning, actually reduce effort and energy. Your brain literally downregulates the drive to act because it thinks the job is partly done. A system bypasses this trap entirely. A system doesn't ask you how you feel about the work. A system says, "It's 9 a.m., this is what happens at 9 a.m. The dopamine in a system doesn't come from imagining the big result. It comes from the micro-completion of each step. You finish the call log, small dopamine hit. You send the follow-up email, small dopamine hit. You complete the daily review, small dopamine hit. These small, frequent, predictable rewards are what your brain actually needs to sustain effort over months and years. Not one giant emotional explosion followed by silence. There's another piece to this, and it involves your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala. Your prefrontal cortex is the executive. It plans, it strategizes, it makes rational decisions. Your amygdala is the alarm system. It reacts to threats, discomfort, uncertainty. When you rely on motivation, you're essentially asking your prefrontal cortex to overpower your amygdala every single time you encounter resistance. Every time a client says no, every time a project feels too hard, every time you don't see results fast enough, your amygdala fires up fear and discomfort, and your prefrontal cortex has to expend energy to push through. This is what people call willpower, and it's exhaustible. Studies on ego depletion, and yes, the concept has been debated, but the core observation holds in practical life, show that making repeated effortful decisions drains your capacity for subsequent decisions. You have a finite budget of override capacity each day. A system conserves that budget. When the action is pre-decided, when you've already determined that Tuesday morning means client outreach, that every evening means a 15-minute review, that your AI coaching tool gets a debrief after every sales call, you're not making a decision. You're executing a protocol. The amygdala has less to react to because there's no moment of should I or shouldn't I. The decision was made once at the system level, and now it just runs. This is why habits feel effortless once formed. The neural pathway has been grooved through repetition. Synaptic connections have strengthened through a process called long-term potentiation, and the behavior shifts from being cortex-dependent to being basal ganglia-dependent. It moves from the deliberate system to the automatic system. And that's when things get interesting, because now your conscious mind is freed up to think about strategy, creativity, nuance, the things that actually differentiate you. Let me pull this up to a higher level, because what I've just described isn't only a productivity hack. It reveals something fundamental about how value is created in the world. Naval Ravikant talks about the idea of specific knowledge, the unique combination of skills, experiences, and instincts that you develop by following your genuine curiosity and investing deeply in areas that can't easily be taught in a classroom. But here's what people miss about Naval's framework. Specific knowledge is useless if it stays in your head. It becomes valuable only when it enters the world, through a product, a service, a conversation, a piece of content, a deal. And the bridge between having specific knowledge and deploying it is not motivation. It's a system of output. Naval himself has said that the people who succeed are the ones who can consistently produce and ship, not the ones who occasionally have brilliant insights but never build the discipline to express them. Think about what he says about leverage: code, media, capital, labor. These are multipliers, but a multiplier applied to zero is still zero. If your daily output is inconsistent, sometimes you create, sometimes you don't, sometimes you show up, sometimes you disappear, then no amount of leverage will save you. Leverage amplifies what's already consistent. A system is what makes your output consistent enough to be worth leveraging. Charlie Munger approaches this from a different angle, but arrives at the same place. Munger's great insight is inversion. Instead of asking, "How do I succeed?" ask, "How would I guarantee failure?" and then avoid doing those things. If you invert the motivation question, it becomes very clear very fast. How would you guarantee that you never build momentum, never compound your skills, never develop client relationships, never finish anything important? Easy. Make everything dependent on how you feel that morning. Make every productive day contingent on an emotional spark that may or may not show up. That's the recipe for guaranteed inconsistency. And inconsistency is the single most reliable way to fail slowly. Munger also warns about what he calls the Lollapalooza effect, when multiple psychological biases stack on top of each other to create catastrophic outcomes. When you rely on motivation, you're vulnerable to a Lollapalooza of failure. Social proof bias makes you think that because influencers talk about finding your passion, that's the real path. Reward super-response tendency makes you chase the dopamine of planning over the tedium of executing. Deprival superreaction makes you feel devastated when the motivation feeling disappears, as if something has been taken from you. And denial makes you blame external circumstances. "I just wasn't in the right headspace," instead of examining the structural problem. A system interrupts all of these biases simultaneously because it removes the decision point where biases do their damage. Now Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who coined the term flow, made an observation that most people completely misunderstand. People think flow is this mystical state that descends upon artists and athletes in moments of divine inspiration. It's not. Csikszentmihalyi studied thousands of creative professionals, and what he found was that flow is a system product. It emerges reliably under specific conditions. Clear goals, immediate feedback, and a challenge level that's slightly above your current skill level. Notice what's not on that list. Feeling motivated, feeling inspired, feeling ready. Flow doesn't care about your feelings. Flow cares about structure. When you set up your environment, your task sequence, and your feedback loops correctly, flow shows up. Not every time, but often enough to compound. This is exactly what I've experienced in my own work. I build AI systems that help salespeople grow tools for daily debriefs, client analysis, talk track refinement. And one of the first things I noticed when working with salespeople is that the ones who improve fastest aren't the most talented or the most motivated. They're the ones who establish a daily rhythm of review. They talk to the AI tool after every call. They log what worked and what didn't. They don't wait until they feel inspired to reflect on their performance. They built reflection into the structure of their day. And over weeks and months, their pattern recognition sharpens, their emotional resilience deepens, their closing rates improve, not because they had a breakthrough moment. Because they had a system that accumulated breakthroughs silently, one micro-adjustment at a time. There's a principle in the Talmudic business tradition that connects to this powerfully. The tradition emphasizes that knowledge only becomes real when it enters exchange, when it's applied, tested, transacted, put at risk in the marketplace. Theoretical knowledge that never touches the world is not yet knowledge, it's potential. And the difference between potential and actualized knowledge is, once again, not motivation. It's the commitment structure, the covenant, the daily practice, the discipline of showing up and putting your understanding on the line. The Talmud doesn't romanticize inspiration, it systematizes obligation. You study every day, not because you feel like it, because the covenant demands it. And through that structure, depth emerges that no amount of sporadic enthusiasm could produce. So if systems are the answer, how do you actually build one? Because just build a system is itself a kind of vague advice if we don't break it down into something you can execute. The science of deliberate practice, as articulated by Anders Ericsson, gives us the clearest framework. Here's what deliberate practice actually requires, and pay attention because most people get this wrong. First, a clearly defined subskill, not get better at sales. That's too vague for your brain to act on. Something like improve my opening 30 seconds on cold calls, or get better at reading client hesitation signals. Your brain can't practice a generality, it can only practice a specific. Second, practice at the edge of your current ability, not in your comfort zone where everything is easy and familiar. Not way beyond your ability, where everything is confusing and demoralizing. Right at the border. This is where neuroplasticity operates. Your brain literally rewires itself most aggressively when you're struggling but not failing. The synaptic connections that form during this edge state practice are stronger and more durable than those formed during easy repetition. Third, immediate feedback. This is where most self-improvement efforts collapse. People practice in the dark. They do the thing, they don't know if they did it well, and they repeat the same errors for years and call it experience. Experience without feedback is just time passing. You need a mirror. That mirror can be a mentor, a recording of your own performance, an analytics dashboard, or, and this is where my work lives, an AI tool designed to give you specific, honest, contextual feedback on what you actually did, not what you think you did. Fourth, targeted correction. Once you get feedback, you have to adjust, not vaguely try harder. Specifically change one element. If the feedback says you're talking too much in the first 2 minutes of a client meeting, the correction is: in your next meeting, say you're opening and then ask a question within 45 seconds. That's a precise, measurable adjustment. Now, here's where most people need to hear something that's a little uncomfortable. You probably know your weaknesses. You know which parts of your work you avoid, which skills you're weakest in, which situations make you want to run. The natural human instinct is to lean into your strengths and ignore the weaknesses. And there's a version of that advice that's correct. You should absolutely develop your strengths to a level of genuine excellence, because that's where your differentiation lives. But if your weakness is actively blocking your strengths from reaching the market, you have to address it. For example, I know many technically brilliant people, engineers, developers, analysts, who are phenomenal at building things but terrible at communicating the value of what they've built. Their weakness in expression, in selling, in articulating value to a non-technical audience, creates a bottleneck that their technical strength cannot overcome. In that case, the right move is not to double down on technical skill. It's to build a minimum viable communication system, a framework for how you present, how you pitch, how you follow up, and practice it deliberately until it's no longer a bottleneck. You don't have to become a world-class communicator. You have to become competent enough that your real strength can get through to the people who need it. The reverse is also true. If you're a natural communicator, but your product knowledge is shallow, no amount of charisma will save you in a serious B2B conversation. The client will sense the gap. They'll feel it before they can articulate it. And trust, which is the real currency of any sale, will not form. The key insight from cross-domain learning, what Barbara Oakley calls learning how to learn, is that skills from one area transfer to another in non-linear ways. The discipline you build from a daily writing practice transfers to the discipline of daily client outreach. The pattern recognition you develop from studying negotiation transfers to reading social dynamics in a team meeting. This is why a system that gets you practicing across multiple skill domains in a structured way doesn't just add up linearly. It compounds. Each skill makes the other skills more effective. But only if you're actually doing them consistently, which brings us back to the system. Let me give you a concrete scenario so this isn't abstract. Imagine you're a salesperson, or honestly, anyone who needs to sell their ideas, which means everyone, and you've just had a rough week. 3 proposals rejected. 2 clients went dark. 1 meeting went badly because you misread the room. Friday afternoon, you're sitting at your desk and you feel nothing. No motivation, no drive, no vision board energy. Just the flat, grey reality of things not working. This is the moment that separates the people who build something from the people who don't. If you're operating on motivation, this is where you stop. You tell yourself you need to recharge. You scroll social media. Maybe you watch a motivational video, feel a brief surge, and then the surge fades because it doesn't connect to any immediate action. Monday comes and you're right back where you were, except now you've also lost 2 days of potential momentum. If you're operating on a system, here's what happens instead. It's Friday, 4 p.m. Your system says, end of week review. You open your AI coaching tool, or your journal, or your spreadsheet, whatever your mirror is, and you run through each of those 3 rejections. Not emotionally, structurally. What did the client actually say? Where in the conversation did the energy shift? Were you solving a problem they cared about, or a problem you assumed they cared about? You log the patterns. Maybe you notice that in all 3 rejections, you led with features instead of asking about their current pain. That's not a failure, that's data. Data you can use in next week's calls. Then you look at the 2 clients who went dark. You draft follow-up messages, not needy, not pushy, but value forward. Maybe you share an article relevant to something they mentioned in your last conversation. Maybe you reference a market shift that affects their industry. You're not selling. You're staying in their field of vision with relevance. This is how long-term relationships are built, not through big gestures, but through consistent, thoughtful contact that demonstrates you're paying attention. And the meeting that went badly, you replay it. If you recorded it, even better. You identify the moment you misread the room. Maybe you were pushing for a close when the client was still in evaluation mode. Maybe you were presenting solutions before they finished articulating the problem. You flag this as your deliberate practice focus for next week. In every meeting, don't present a solution until the client has stated the problem in their own words at least twice. None of this required motivation. None of it required feeling pumped. All it required was a pre-built sequence of actions that you've committed to executing regardless of emotional state. And here's the thing that's almost paradoxical. By the time you finish this review process, you often do feel a version of motivation. Not the fireworks kind, the quiet, earned kind. The kind that comes from seeing your own progress, understanding the mechanics of what happened, and knowing that you have specific adjustments to make. That feeling, that's real confidence. It's not the confidence of telling yourself, I believe in myself. It's the confidence of having a system that improves you whether you believe in yourself or not. This is what I mean when I say that action creates the feeling, not the other way around. Your mirror neurons, the neural circuits that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe yourself performing an action, generate a sense of identity through repeated behavior. You don't become a disciplined person by deciding to be disciplined. You become a disciplined person by executing disciplined actions until your brain's self-model updates. The system creates the identity. The identity then makes the system easier to maintain. It's a virtuous cycle, but it has to start with the structure, not the self-image. Let me give you another scenario, because this principle extends far beyond sales. Suppose you're trying to build a personal brand, you want to share your expertise online, position yourself as a thought leader, create content that attracts the right clients or collaborators. The motivation approach says, wait until you have something brilliant to say, then post it. The system approach says, every Tuesday and Thursday you create a piece of content. Some of it will be mediocre. That's fine. The act of creating consistently does several things simultaneously. It trains your brain to think in terms of shareable ideas. It builds an archive of content that compounds over time. It signals to your audience and to the algorithms that you're reliable. And occasionally, through the sheer volume of attempts, something genuinely excellent emerges. But it emerges from the system, not from waiting for the muse. The same principle applies to learning a new skill, building a network, developing a product, or managing your health. The common thread is always the same. Remove the dependency on emotional state. Pre-decide the action. Build the feedback loop. Let the system carry you through the days when your feelings aren't cooperating. Now, I want to address a nuance here, because I don't want this to become its own kind of dogma. I'm not saying feelings don't matter. I'm not saying you should ignore your emotional state entirely. Emotions are valuable signals. If you consistently dread a particular type of work, that might be telling you something real about misalignment. Maybe you're in the wrong market. Maybe you're serving clients you don't actually enjoy working with. Maybe you've built a system around the wrong goal. A good system includes checkpoints for questioning the system itself. Munger would call this knowing the edge of your competence. Naval would call it being honest with yourself about what you actually want. The system is not a prison. It's a scaffold, and like any scaffold, it should be periodically examined to make sure it's still supporting the right structure. But here's the critical distinction. You examine the system at the system level during a scheduled review with clear criteria. You do not examine it in the moment when you don't feel like doing the work. That's not examination. That's rationalization. There's a huge difference between sitting down on Sunday evening, looking at your week's data, and deciding that you need to adjust your outreach strategy because the market has shifted, versus lying in bed on Tuesday morning and deciding you don't feel like making calls today because maybe this whole approach isn't right. The first is strategic. The second is your amygdala hijacking your prefrontal cortex. Let me connect this to something broader, because the implications go beyond personal productivity. We live in an era where AI is reshaping every industry, every role, every career path. The people who will thrive in this environment are not the ones with the most motivation. They're the ones with the best systems for leveraging new tools, adapting to new realities, and consistently producing value in changing conditions. When I built my AI coaching tool for sales professionals, I wasn't trying to replace human judgment. I was trying to create a system component, a feedback mechanism that's available 24/7, that doesn't get tired, that doesn't judge you emotionally, that simply reflects back what you did and helps you see what you could adjust. It's a mirror built into the daily workflow, and the salespeople who use it systematically, every day after every call, not just when they feel like it, improve at rates that surprise even them. This is the real meaning of selling yourself, by the way. When I talk about sales in a broad sense, I don't mean manipulation. I don't mean tricking people into buying things they don't need. I mean the act of making your value visible and accessible to the people who need it. Every professional in every field is engaged in this act whether they acknowledge it or not. The programmer who can't explain the value of their code to a non-technical stakeholder is failing to sell. The consultant who has deep expertise but doesn't follow up with prospects is failing to sell. The creator who has important ideas but only shares them sporadically is failing to sell. And in every case, the bottleneck is not a lack of motivation, it's a lack of system. Selling, real selling, the kind that builds long-term relationships and creates mutual value, is actually one of the purest expressions of creative output. Because it requires you to take what's inside your head, translate it into language and action that serves someone else, and do it consistently enough that trust can form. Trust doesn't form in a single interaction. Trust forms through repeated contact, reliability, and demonstrated understanding. That's a system outcome. You can't motivate your way into trust. You build it through structure. There's a passage in the Talmudic tradition that essentially says, if your knowledge doesn't create value in the world, it's not yet complete knowledge. Knowledge that stays theoretical, that never gets tested in the marketplace of ideas or commerce, is potential, not power. And the bridge from potential to power is not inspiration. It's the discipline of consistent output, consistent engagement, consistent offering of your knowledge to the people who can use it. Wealth, in this tradition, is not about greed. It's about proof that your understanding of the world is accurate enough, practical enough, and communicated effectively enough to create value for others. If it can't do that, something in the chain is broken, and the most likely break point is not your knowledge itself, but your system for deploying it. Here's what I want you to actually do after watching this, because understanding without action is the fastest path to sophisticated procrastination. Today, right now, if you can, write down the one activity that, if you did it every single day for the next 90 days, would most change your professional trajectory. Just one, not 5, not 10. One, maybe it's 30 minutes of prospecting, maybe it's one piece of content, maybe it's a 10-minute debrief of your most important conversation that day. Whatever it is, make it specific, make it small enough to actually do when you're tired and don't feel like it, and make it non-negotiable. Then build a feedback mechanism around it. How will you know if you did it well? Is there a recording you can review, a metric you can track, a tool, AI or otherwise, that can give you structured reflection? If you have no feedback, you have no system. You just have a habit that might be reinforcing the wrong patterns. Next, schedule a weekly review, 15 minutes, same time every week. Look at what you logged. Look for patterns. Ask yourself 3 questions. What worked? What didn't? What will I adjust next week? This review is not optional. This is where the compounding happens. Without it, you're just doing the thing on autopilot without improvement. And finally, adopt this rule. Never evaluate whether the system is working while you're in the middle of a low motivation day. Only evaluate the system during your scheduled review with data in front of you. If the data says the system needs to change, change it. If the data says the system is working but you just don't feel like it, keep going. Feelings are inputs, not instructions. One more thing, and this is important. Give the system time. People abandon systems after 2 weeks because they don't see dramatic results. Compounding is invisible at first. The difference between day 1 and day 14 is almost undetectable. The difference between day 1 and day 90 is enormous, but you have to survive the invisible phase. That's where most people quit. Not because the system failed, but because they expected motivation-style instant gratification from a compounding-style process. The system rewards patience. Motivation rewards impulse. Choose accordingly. If you're building something, a career, a business, a skill, a life, the architecture underneath matters more than the emotion on top. Motivation is a guest. It visits when it wants. It leaves when it wants. You can't build a house on a guest. A system is the foundation. It doesn't care if you're excited. It doesn't care if you're tired. It does its job because you designed it to do its job. And over time, not overnight, but over real, honest, compounding time, it will carry you further than any burst of inspiration ever could. The people who change their lives are not the most motivated. They're the most systematic. And the beautiful irony is that once the system is running, motivation shows up more often, not as a prerequisite, but as a byproduct. You earn the feeling by doing the work. You don't do the work by chasing the feeling. Build the system. Trust the system. Let the system build you. If this resonated, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and follow along for more. I'll leave you with a question. What's the one thing you keep waiting to feel ready for? And what would happen if you just built a system around it and started today?